The highway between Tonopah and the Great Western Ranges looks straightforward on a map, a line drawn by a steady hand, crossing a page the color of old bone. In person it wavers with heat, a black ribbon unspooling through basins where the earth seems to be exhaling. You drive out there and discover how small a car actually is. You learn that horizons don't hold still. From the shoulder, dunes look like sleeping animals. From the windshield, they look like weather paused between breaths. Someone once wrote that Nevada is a geography of absence. That sounds like poetry until it's the last clue you have. June 1982. Laura and Michael Bennett left Portland with confetti still in the hems of their clothes. She was 23, an art teacher who preferred charcoal to acrylic and had a habit of photographing light before she photographed people. He was 26, a dealership mechanic with strong hands and a mind that wouldn't stop inventorying solutions. They'd saved enough to buy a second-hand cream-colored Pontiac Lemons with a patina of care and just enough chrome to make the sun like it. They packed a canvas tent, an aluminum cooler, a box of cassette tapes with her notes in looping script, Joni, Otis, The Clash, Only If We're Awake at Midnight, and 3 rolls of Kodak Gold. Before they left, Laura clipped a Polaroid to their fridge, 2 faces slightly out of focus, the kind of smile you get when you're happy and running late. Their plan was simple the way love makes plans simple. They would drive south through Oregon, angle across northern Nevada, and slip into California by way of a road Michael had circled on a map, the kind of thin gray line that promises empty space and miles you'll remember. They wanted a stretch of desert, so wide it would reset the sense of scale they'd had since childhood. They wanted starlight unpolluted by neon. A long road to teach us we're small, Laura wrote on the back of a postcard they never sent. And then the ocean, to teach us we're smaller. At a motel in Winnemucca, they fixed the too-fast shower knob with a hairpin and laughed like criminals. In a diner in Austin, they learned that pie can be an apology for everything a long day has said to your body. People like them without trying. Laura smiled at waitresses as if they'd exchanged letters for years. Michael listened when old men talked about weather as if it were an opinion you could rebut. A cashier in a hardware store watched them choose a plastic fuel can and said, without knowing why she said it, "Make sure you fill it." They did. On the morning of the 18th, they turned the Pontiac onto a two-lane that held steady for 30 miles at a time before deciding to seek a pass, climbing like a sentence that refuses a period. The sky was a hard, generous blue. Laura rested her feet on the dash, camera in her lap, saying every 10 minutes, "Look," which is what love is, an ongoing imperative to witness. Michael drove with 2 fingers on the wheel, the way men do when the road and the car have agreed to behave. They were discovered there by no one. The desert does not announce that you've entered it. It simply stops pretending you haven't. The last confirmed sighting came just after 4 in the afternoon at a gas station outside Tonopah, where the air smelled like rubber and gasoline and rain that had no intention of falling. The attendant's name was Kenny. He would tell the story so many times in the years after that doctors would comment on his recall. Not knowing memory is a muscle you exercise when a life insists you keep it fit. He remembered the color of Laura's headband, red, the sweat line on Michael's shirt, half moon, the way they joked about the heat, is this the oven or the broiler? The way Michael checked the oil and the belts and then checked them again. He remembered Laura asking for a paper map, even though they had one, because she liked to spread them out and press her hands on names. He drew them a route toward the dunes, turn off at the Old Mill Road, then the wash, then another 5 miles if you're feeling brave, but don't let the sand talk you into anything. And felt good about it, because there is a real pleasure in helping travelers find the thing they think will change them. They bought sodas and a bag of ice and a pack of matches because camping is a ritual you perform to convince yourself that a night outside won't mistake you for something that belongs there. Michael topped off the tank, so the needle hung sweetly on full. Laura photographed the shadow of a fuel pump across the hood. They said thank you twice, waved, and drove west into heat you could see. After that, silence. Not only the deserts, which is deep and crowded with sound if you stand still long enough, but the bureaucratic kind that has to harden into a noun before anyone will circle it in ink. Missing. When they didn't arrive in Bishop the next morning, Laura's friend assumed they'd stopped to camp, that their sentence had been extended by an ellipsis the desert likes to insert. By the second evening, concern was a shape that lived at the front window. By the third, Michael's brother called the highway patrol. It is a modern mercy that a human voice can ask over radio for other voices to begin a search. It is an older cruelty that distance does not bend to this mercy. The search did what searches do when a landscape is both precise and vast. Civil Air Patrol planes stitched neat grids above basins and ranges, pilots shading sections on paper maps, as if coloring inside lines could persuade fate to do the same. A helicopter out of Fallon slung low over dry washes where flash floods carve new sentences every monsoon, kicking dust devils into the next county. Deputies marked tire marks that wandered and then vanished like promises. Volunteers drove dirt roads they hadn't visited since their fathers took them there, headlights smearing amber on Joshua tree spines at midnight. A noisy, hopeful civilization toppled itself into the space around the last known fact. They bought gas here. The desert tolerated the fuss with its usual politeness. Sun rose and dropped. Heat unrolled its arguments. Wind erased what it could and filed the rest for later. Searchers found a soda can of the brand Laura had bought at Kinney's station, half buried 2 miles off the highway, chastely bright after a single scouring gust freed it. They found tire tracks that slipped off asphalt and followed an old mine road, then a dry wash where the pattern became confused, then nothing. They found a campfire ring with a char that was older than a week and younger than a year. They found a denim jacket sleeve snagged on a creosote thorn that could have been any denim jacket from the last decade of the American project. They brought everything they found into town and pinned it to corkboard, as if a collage could argue with a fact. On the 7th day, they found hope, which came in the form of a rancher's statement that he'd seen a cream-colored car headed towards Sand Mountain. It turned out he'd only overheard it at a bar from a man who'd heard it from a teenager who wanted to be part of a story. On the 12th day, they found fatigue. On the 15th, they found anger, the small, hard kind aimed at fate and its administrators. On the 19th, they found economy, the ledger that tells you hours are money and money is finite and you have a county to run. The official search closed with the tender brutality of a stamp on a form. What remained continued. Michael's father drove the route himself in a '71 Ford, stopping on shoulders to stare longer than a man should at nothing. Laura's mother slept with the phone on her chest and woke with dial marks pressed into her cheek. Kinney, at the gas station, refilled 100 cars a week and watched couples with maps try not to be versions of the last couple with maps. He kept the receipt with the Bennett's signature in a drawer not because he believed it would be needed, but because he believed paper can keep an event from blowing away. Theories behaved as theories do in the vacuum after an official story refuses to appear. Some said bandits, as if the 1980s in Nevada were still wild enough for that particular romance. Some said cult, a persistent, solvent rumor in desert counties, because horror prefers a human face. Some said they ran away together to Mexico because love must be either perfect or performatively imperfect to satisfy certain audiences. But people who knew the desert shook their heads. A wrong turn onto a track that looks supportive until it isn't. Sand that accepts weight and then cancels it. Heat that models patience until your body is the only unpersuaded thing left. You can walk out. You can't always walk out together. Years slipped around the story like wind around a dune, shaping and reshaping. At Thanksgiving, someone at Laura's aunt's table would begin a sentence and then not finish it. Grief leans against language until it refuses to stand. Michael's younger brother, Andrew, folded newspaper clippings into a shoe box and took it with him when he moved apartments, his girlfriend asking gently why, as if she didn't hear the question answer itself. A bulletin board at the sheriff's office in Nye County kept their flyer tucked into a corner, the sun bleaching their hair lighter every summer. In the late 80s, a radio host devoted 3 episodes of his nighttime show to vanishings across the Great Basin and took calls from men who didn't want to say their names. In the early 90s, a hiker with a disposable camera found a pair of tire tracks arcing into a shallow dune face and took 3 photographs that, when developed, revealed only the certainty that sand keeps secrets in centimeters. The Pontiac became, for storytellers, everything cars have always been: a symbol, a talisman, a container for hope. Truckers told each other over tuna melts at diners in Hawthorne and Beatty that they'd seen it on a clear night, a white shark fin of a roofline caught in a slant of moonlight, and then, when they turned around, it was gone. A deputy's wife, who, to her credit, never insisted on being believed, said she dreamed the car was a white animal buried in a sleeping dune, breathing slow, waiting to wake. A kid from Pahrump sold Xeroxed pamphlets at swap meets claiming the car had been used in a crime and then hidden. He made $50 over 3 years and started calling himself an author. Decades grind down even the sharper edges of a wound. Laura's parents died without answers and near the end asked people to stop bringing it up, which is not the cruelty it sounds like. To go gentle, you sometimes have to go alone. Michael's father moved to a damp state and began to sleep through the night. Andrew, who had been 20 when the Bennetts vanished, turned 40, then 50, with an ache that adjusted to live under the ribs. He got a call every couple of years from a detective with cold case in his title and learned to brace his voice to say thank you for the effort even when there was no effort to thank. And then the desert did what the desert does best. It rearranged itself. August 2012 brought heat with teeth and a wind that came in like a decision. Weather reports called it a historic event, a high-pressure system dancing with a monsoonal low, so the air learned to lift sand in sheets. Dunes migrated measurable feet in days. A BLM hydrologist said, on television, "We're watching a landscape become something else in real time." A rancher in the Amargosa Valley came out after 3 days to find a new scarp across his grazing land where there had been none. A photographer drove out to document the aftermath and wept because the patterns the wind had left were so beautiful and because she had not done anything to earn them. A week later, on a Sunday when the heat felt resentful about having to share the sky with clouds, an off-roader named Carl Jenkins rode his ATV across an area he'd crossed a dozen times and felt the front wheels knock against something that wasn't geology. He killed the engine and listened because sound can be a clue. Then he kicked at the sand with his boot and touched metal. In 5 minutes, he'd uncovered the corner of a windshield frame. In an hour, hands raw, a shovel borrowed from a friend as foolish as he was committed, he'd exposed the suggestion of a roofline. He called the sheriff with the practiced calm of someone who has watched missing person flyers yellow on a bulletin board. The dig that followed was halfway excavation, halfway vigil. Deputies roped a perimeter. BLM brought a small loader. The county borrowed a shade tent from the fairgrounds. People are tender in the presence of old tragedies. They dug in the soft way you dig when what you want from the ground is permission. The dune, uncomplaining, relaxed its hold. First the roof, cream paint filmed with dust, but legendary in its refusal to become rust. Then the rear window, gone. Then the tops of door frames, caked, as if someone had been trying to pour the car out of a jar. When they reached the driver's side door handle, an investigator placed his palm on it and closed his eyes very briefly, which was either prayer or recalibration. Inside, sand. And then, under the sand, time rendered to bone. 2 skeletons in their seats. The driver's hands still on the wheel in that ironic way skeletons have of suggesting habit. The passenger's head tipped slightly as if listening, an old expression of love encoded past muscle. The back seat held the ruin of a canvas knapsack, a camera case whose leather had rotted into suggestion, a roll of film in a black canister that a lab would later try to coax into confession and fail because chemistry respects itself. The glove box offered a folded desert map, with Michael's handwriting tracing 2 alternatives in pencil and a third line drawn later, different lead, different pressure, a spur road into dunes annotated for view. In the door pocket, a book of matches from a diner in Austin, the front 2 torn away. On the passenger's left hand, a thin wedding ring that had outlasted flesh and fashion and, apparently, the argument against hope. Dental records, fast. Names, faster than the rumor would have liked, because rumor prefers suspense. The Bennetts had been found. The press conference was careful in the way press conferences are careful when the subject is both a relief and a wound. The sheriff behind a folding table, the BLM spokesperson to his left, a deputy coroner to his right. The sheriff said the word closure and stopped, like a man approaching an edge he wasn't sure could bear him. The coroner explained that trauma on bone was absent, that dehydration leaves fewer signature traces at that stage than other ends. The investigator described sand inside the engine bay and around the exhaust, an intake snorkel clogged like a throat. He gestured vaguely to indicate the scale of the dune as it must have been decades ago, and admitted the desert rolls dice with 1,000 faces. Michael's brother arrived with a face like a geography lesson. He put his hand out and didn't find anything to touch that made sense. He asked to see the car, and a deputy found a way to say yes that honored procedures without denying a human need. Andrew stood by the driver's door and looked at the dash, the cracked vinyl, the gauges asleep. He ran a finger along the edge of the map in the glove compartment and said, to no one, he'd have fixed it if fixing it could be done. He took his sister-in-law's ring in a plastic evidence bag and pressed the plastic to his lips and didn't apologize. The forensic story that settled into the file is the simplest version without being stupid. The Bennetts left the highway following an older graded road shown as a faint line on the map, common, even advisable then if you wanted a view without traffic. Near the dunes, the graded road devolved into a track across sand stabilized by the memory of tires more than by any solid substrate. They continued, slowly at first, then confidently, then too far. The Lemons had adequate clearance for American roads, but not a wilderness that had decided to be powder. The rear tires sank. Michael rocked the car, forward and back, deepening the trap the way you do when you believe momentum is a friend. They dug with hands and a flattened coffee can from the cooler. Wind kicked in, just a little, and turned pale sand into a veil that slid politely into every cavity. Shade shrank. Evidence suggested they tried to burn a signal. Charred paper scraps under the front bumper and a scar on the sand where heat had licked. Matches alone don't hold a column of smoke. The jack lay on its side, useless in ground that behaves like a liquid. The spare tire was half buried a yard behind the trunk where they tried to use it as a platform for an escape that needed a miracle of friction. The dashboard clock, a simple mechanical one, not electrical, had ceased somewhere around 5:17, which meant nothing and became too meaningful for some people anyway. The passenger seat had been reclined, in later imaginings a gesture of comfort, in practical terms maybe a way to lie out of the sun. There were no footprints leading away that the first excavators could find. The wind that had buried the car had finished that work long ago, and well. There was a note, of a sort. On the underside of the driver's visor, in ballpoint pen pressed hard, 2 lines, stuck 6:18 p.m. Trying to dig. Water 1/2. Below it, lighter. Love you mom/love you dad. The coroner did not release that to the press. Andrew saw it because someone decided to make a good decision. He copied it onto a napkin with a hand that shook and then folded the napkin as if he could rehide a thing that had been hidden badly by time. For a month, reporters did what reporters do. Wrote them cleanly for readers who want their pain curated and their nightmares handled. 30 years beneath the dunes. Love found together. The desert keeps, then gives. A producer called Andrew and asked if he would sit in the car while explaining what it felt like to find it that way. He said no in a voice he didn't know belonged to him. A museum in Las Vegas called the county and asked whether the Pontiac could be exhibited as part of a responsible installation on Nevada disappearances. The county said not yet, then yes, then only under conditions that made the museum rethink their pitch. In the end, the car sat under a tarp in an impound yard while paperwork taught itself to reproduce. The funeral, at a church in Portland Laura's parents had once convinced themselves to attend, was small and full. Photographs lined a table at the back, 2 kids on a high school bleacher, a couple in thrifted coats in the snow, a pair at a kitchen table with paper spread everywhere, 2 faces in front of a car too bright for the film. The pastor said mercy and meant it. Laura's friend from Bishop told the story of how they were supposed to arrive and didn't, and how she had set 3 plates anyway that first night, and how, for years after, whenever she cooked for guests, she set 1 extra without thinking and then took it away. Andrew read the visor lines without explanation. People stood in the parking lot afterward as if waiting for a second service where someone would bring something bedrock and correct. When nothing came, they hugged each other with the gentle ferocity of the newly informed. Weeks later, the county let Kenny see the car because he had been the last to see them whole and because deputies do small kindnesses as a way of balancing what their jobs require. He touched the paint and said, softly, "You were careful," and then laughed, because what else do you do when talking to a car in front of a deputy? He went back to work and kept pumping gas, older enough now that the young travelers called him sir without irony. He still told people not to let the sand talk them into anything. The line had hardened into commandment. The Pontiac did make its way, eventually, into a museum, not in a glittering hall, but in a quiet annex wing where the label copy had been written by someone who respected verbs. The car sat at an angle suggestive of the way it had rested under the dune, the front bumper slightly low, a glass wall keeping hands back without demonizing curiosity. Beside it, under glass, a map with Michael's penciled route and a photograph of Laura's camera case, now too fragile to display. Visitors paused with a reverence that squares uneasily with spectacle. Children pointed at the car and asked whether people were still inside. Parents answered no with relief different in pitch from the normal end-of-museum relief. A docent, retired BLM, boots shined as if for inspection, told the story not as a ghost tale, but as a lesson in length and heat. How dunes move, how tire tracks vanish, how a landscape can be a clock with hands you can't see. In the years that followed, the story joined the other stories deserts collect. Truckers still left gallons of water under creosote along lonely routes with a note written in Sharpie. Free. Off-road clubs adopted a rule named for the Bennetts. Never crest a dune you haven't walked. At a wedding in Reno, the officiant told the couple to listen to the wind and to each other, and it sounded foolish until you remembered you were not immune to a place's vocabulary. A novelist wrote a book that borrowed the outlines of the story and added a stranger with a gun because he didn't think weather and sand and hope were dramatic enough. The family didn't sue. They didn't read it either. As for answers, the good, satisfying kind, they remain scarce. People who love the desert never really ask for them. You learn, out there, that closure is a town 100 miles beyond the gas you have. The file in the county archive ends with a page that reads cause of death, probable heatstroke/dehydration. Contribution, factors, wind, sand entrapment. Evidence of foul play, none. Personal effects, wedding ring, female, map, camera case, matchbook, Austin diner. You can copy the words down, but not the space between the lines, which is where the desert is stashed. If you drive past Tonopah now and get gas at a station that is not Kenny's because nothing except geology remains the same that long, you'll see a rack of maps by the register that have been updated to agree with the fact that tourists prefer their unknowns curated. The woman behind the counter will tell you which roads are paved and which are not, and which look paved from a distance, and then stop keeping that promise. There will be a bulletin board near the bathrooms with flyers for bands and rummage sales and lost dogs, and, in the corner, a sun-faded copy of the Bennett's missing poster with found stamped across the bottom. You might find that you look away quickly, then look back. That reflex is called being human, where survival is a learned behavior. In the evenings, wind still combs the dunes. You can watch ripples move like a written language meant for another species. Somewhere out in that sea of slow motion, there is an empty pocket of air the exact shape of a Pontiac roof as it once displaced sand. The desert has already filled it and forgotten it. Wind doesn't do sentiment, only weather. But sometimes, if you stand on a ridge at dusk and look toward an old highway that still treats the horizon like an obligation, you will see headlights in pairs and wish all the pairs belonged to people who knew to turn around sooner than they did. You will wish that for yourself too, and then you will drive carefully, and then you will forget, because forgetting is how we keep leaving the house. Laura and Michael set out on a road drawn thin across a map because they believed good roads end in oceans and pictures and stories. The road ended in sand. There is a day on which they were last seen happy at a gas station, and a day on which a deputy, with a carefully modulated voice, said their names in a room where cameras clicked. Between those days lie 30 years of wind. Between those days lie the small, unremarkable efforts of hundreds of people, the pilot shading a grid square, the volunteer carrying more water than she needed so she could give it away, the rancher who doubled back because a flash of cream in his peripheral vision might be more than the angle of sun on a salt pan. Between those days lies, finally, a car emerging from a dune like a story the earth has decided to tell at last. This is not a moral, not really. If it is a warning, it's one the desert offers without malice. Know what you're crossing. Don't expect the silence to tell you what it means. Never mistake a track for a road just because a map decided to admit it exists. If it is a love story, and it is, stubbornly, it is one that ends as well as love can under the circumstances. Two people found where they sat together, the ring still on a bone thinner than a wire, a hand still on a wheel turned forever toward the possibility of movement. The dune that held them no longer exists in that shape. Another dune does. The wind is new and the same, and it will be tomorrow. The highway, for what it's worth, still runs its hand flat over the basin and the range, showing travelers what happens when a line trusts itself too much and too little at once. They set out across the desert, perfect in the way only newlyweds can be. Decades later, a storm undid what an older wind had done and showed us where the car slept. The rest is what the sand keeps: names, dates, heat, a lesson you can carry like water, and the small, precise weight of two rings that completed their circle long after anyone expected them to.